Imagine walking down a street so narrow your shoulders brush both walls at once, while somewhere above you, a bucket of filth is about to be emptied straight onto your head. Welcome to Paris. Not the Paris of postcards and perfume, but the real one, the one that existed 400 years ago, when the City of Light was actually a city of shadows, mud, gunpowder, and gold. If you think you know Paris, forget everything, because the Paris of the 1600s would shock you more than any horror film. And by the end of this video, you will understand why this single city on the banks of the Seine became the beating heart of an entire continent's power, madness, and beauty. Picture the year 1600. The century has just turned, and Paris is waking up from decades of religious war, still bruised, still hungry, but already dreaming bigger than any city in Europe. 500,000 people are crammed inside walls that were never meant to hold so many souls. The streets are so tight that carriages scrape against timber-framed houses, leaning so far forward they nearly kiss each other above your head, blocking out the sun. There is no sewage system worth the name. Waste runs down the middle of the street in an open gutter. And if you are not careful, or not rich enough to own a good pair of boots, you will be wading through it. The smell alone could knock a modern visitor unconscious. A mixture of smoke, roasting meat, unwashed bodies, animal dung, and the metallic tang of the river. And yet, in the middle of all this chaos, something extraordinary is happening. Paris is becoming the most powerful city on the planet. One brick, one decree, and one obsession at a time. At the center of it all sits an island, low and marshy, called the Ile de la Cité, though back then it looked nothing like the postcard image you might expect. Timber yards and grain warehouses crowd its muddy banks. Barges creak in from the countryside loaded with firewood and sacks of flour, and dock workers with cracked hands and sunburned necks haul cargo from dawn until the light fails. This little island is the pulse of the whole city, feeding it, fueling it, and it never sleeps. Just beyond it rises an enormous stone arch celebrating a military triumph, its carved figures staring down at merchants haggling and cartwheels grinding through the dust. Paris has always loved to remind itself of its own greatness, even when its own citizens are starving in its shadow. Now, walk toward the great civic square, where a towering Renaissance building stands like a stern parent watching over unruly children. This is where the city governs itself, where messengers sprint across cobblestones, clutching sealed orders that could mean life or ruin for entire families. Inside, magistrates argue, merchants plead, and petitioners wait for hours just to be heard. Outside, the square boils with a different kind of energy. Street vendors shout over each other, selling bread, ribbons, and gossip in equal measure. Agitators stir the crowd with rumors of taxes and injustice. The wind off the river cuts through everyone equally, prince or pauper. Power here looks solid, carved into stone, but underneath it you can feel how fragile it really is. One bad harvest, one broken promise from the crown, and this same square could erupt into full-blown revolt. If you want to feel the true chaos of 17th century Paris, you need to stand on its most famous bridge. This is not just a way to cross the river. It is a stage, a marketplace, a den of thieves, and a theater all rolled into one narrow strip of stone. Jugglers throw knives into the air, while barbers pull teeth in the open street. And somewhere nearby, a pickpocket is already 3 streets away with your coin purse. Nobles in silk ride past beggars in rags, and neither one seems particularly surprised by the other, because this collision of worlds happens here every single day. Pamphlets change hands almost as fast as coins, spreading news, lies, and revolution in equal measure. Beneath the bridge, fishmongers shout over their reeking stalls, and the sour smell of the river rises thick enough to taste. This bridge is loud, alive, and dangerous, and if these old stones could talk, they would tell you more secrets than every noble court in France combined. But turn a corner, walk through a quiet archway, and suddenly Paris changes its face completely. Behind dignified stone arcades, courtiers stroll and whisper, trading secrets more valuable than jewels. Gravel paths wind past clipped trees and murmuring fountains, offering a rare pocket of silence in a city that never stops shouting. This is elegance built on top of danger, because behind every polite smile in these gardens, someone is calculating their next move in a game where losing could mean exile, or worse. Not far away, A queen's palace rises in serene grandeur, its gardens laid out with mathematical precision, statues standing guard over noble families who stroll the hedges with slow, practiced steps. Their calm is a performance. Behind those quiet footsteps, court schemes are unfolding that could reshape the entire kingdom. Then there is the square built purely to celebrate one man, a perfect circle of stone, framing a towering statue of a king who saw himself not just as a ruler, but as the sun itself. Merchants and soldiers wander through this open space, their footsteps muffled by the sheer symmetry surrounding them. It feels like someone tried to bottle order and calm and pour it directly into the middle of a chaotic city. And, in a way, that is exactly what happened, because this king understood something that few rulers before him ever grasped. If you want to control a restless population, you do not just rule with an army. You rule with beauty, with architecture, with spectacles so overwhelming that people forget to question your power. Not far from there, a great cathedral rises above the rooftops, its dark stone catching the light off the river, like something almost otherworldly. Bells shake the surrounding streets on the hour, and inside, incense curls upward through shafts of colored light, while worshippers murmur prayers heavy with hope and fear. Outside, on the western edge of the city, formal gardens stretch out in perfectly ordered rows of trees and gravel paths, giving Parisians a rare breath of calm before the land opens up into rougher countryside, where the river breeze carries both dust and the last scraps of courtly gossip drifting out of the city. Follow the river further, and the mood shifts again. Here, Paris shows its working muscle. Barges push in loaded with grain and timber, and dock workers shout over the rumble of carts rolling toward the markets. Old weathered gates stand watch over this rougher edge of the city, marking the exact point where polished courtly Paris collides head-on with the hard, unglamorous labor that actually keeps the whole machine running. Without these workers, without this noise and sweat and grime, none of the palaces, none of the gardens, none of the grand statues would exist at all. Now step back and imagine what it actually felt like to live an ordinary life inside this pressure cooker of a city. Families are stacked into tall, leaning houses, sometimes 6 or 7 people sharing a single room. Privacy simply does not exist. You hear your neighbors argue, cook, cry, and celebrate through paper-thin walls at every hour of the day. The streets outside are a constant flood of artisans, clerks, servants, and merchants, all moving, all working, all trying to survive in a city that shows no mercy to the weak. And for the poorest of the poor, life is even harsher. They crowd onto church steps and bridge corners, wrapped in whatever rags they can find against the damp Parisian wind. Children beside them, with hollow, tired eyes, quietly begging for coins or crusts of bread, while carriages of silk and lace roll past without a second glance. This contrast, obscene wealth pressed right up against desperate poverty, is not an accident of the city. It is the city. Winters back then were brutal in a way most of us can barely imagine today. The Seine itself would freeze solid enough to walk across, and when that happened, something magical took over. Parisians flooded onto the ice with skates strapped to their boots, sleds racing between makeshift stalls, selling roasted chestnuts and mulled wine. For a few short weeks, the frozen river became the city's biggest playground, a strange, beautiful truce between nobles and workers who normally never mixed. Cold, bright, and briefly carefree, it was one of the only times all year when the entire city seemed to breathe the same air of joy at the same time. And if you needed an escape from the noise and hunger, even without snow, you could always find your way to a pastry maker's shop, where warm ovens filled the air with the sweet smell of sugar and butter. Tarts, biscuits, and glazed fruits lined the counters, and for just a few coins, both nobles and laborers could pause together and taste a small slice of luxury. In these tiny shops, hidden between towering houses, 17th century Paris allowed itself a rare, quiet indulgence. Nearby, in a covered gallery bustling with life, booksellers laid out fresh pamphlets and forbidden verses that the authorities would rather you never read, while stalls glittering with ribbons and fine cloth pulled in customers chasing the latest fashion. The air buzzed with gossip, bargaining, and quiet ambition, an entire slice of Parisian society compressed into one narrow, crowded corridor, proof that even in the middle of hardship, people never stopped hustling, flirting, and dreaming bigger. Crime in this city was not some rare shock. It was simply part of the rhythm of daily life. Torchlit streets after dark belonged almost entirely to thieves, drunks, and desperate men looking for an easy target. There was no organized police force the way we understand it today. Only a scattering of watchmen who could barely cover a fraction of the sprawling maze of alleyways. Wealthy families hired private guards just to walk them home from an evening at the theater, and even then, robbery was almost expected as a cost of doing business in the capital. Courts handed out punishment with brutal efficiency. Public floggings, brandings, and executions staged in open squares as a warning to anyone tempted to break the law. Crowds gathered to watch these punishments, the same way people gather for entertainment today, cheering, jeering, treating a man's final moments as a kind of grim public theater. It sounds shocking now, but in a city this desperate, spectacle and suffering were often the same thing. Disease stalked these streets just as relentlessly as any thief. Without clean water, without any real understanding of how sickness spread, plague and fever could tear through entire neighborhoods within weeks. Doctors of the era wore strange beaked masks stuffed with herbs, believing bad smells themselves carried illness, and treated patients with methods that ranged from useless to actively dangerous. Bloodletting, questionable tonics, and desperate prayers were often the only defense a family had against an outbreak. Entire streets could be shut off and quarantined overnight. Red crosses painted on doors to mark the sick within, and neighbors would cross to the opposite side of the road rather than risk walking too close. And yet, life did not stop. Markets stayed open, church bells still rang, and Parisians carried on with a kind of grim resilience that feels almost unimaginable from our modern, comfortable distance. Fashion, strangely enough, thrived right alongside all of this hardship. The wealthy dressed as if competing in a silent, endless contest, towering wigs powdered white, lace collars stiff enough to cut skin, and fabrics imported from halfway across the known world. A single outfit could cost more than an ordinary laborer would earn in an entire year. And yet these clothes were paraded through the very same streets where beggars huddled in rags just a few feet away. Perfume became almost a necessity rather than a luxury, since bathing was rare and the streets themselves reeked constantly. So the aristocracy doused themselves in heavy scents simply to survive their own city. Meanwhile, ordinary workers wore practical wool and linen, mended over and over until the fabric itself refused to hold another stitch. A stark and constant visual reminder of exactly where you stood in the strict hierarchy of Parisian society. Food told its own story of division as well. In the grand houses of the nobility, feasts stretched across hours, course after course of roasted meats, rich sauces, and elaborate sugar sculptures designed purely to impress guests rather than satisfy hunger. Meanwhile, just outside those same walls, ordinary Parisians survived largely on coarse bread, thin soups, and whatever cheap vegetables the season allowed. A bad harvest anywhere in the surrounding countryside could send bread prices soaring overnight. And it was often exactly this kind of sudden price spike, more than any political grievance, that sparked riots in the streets. Bread was not just food in this city. It was survival, and any threat to it was treated as a threat to life itself. Entertainment offered a rare kind of relief that cut across almost every social line. Traveling performers set up in open squares, acrobats tumbling through the air, while crowds gasped and applauded. Puppet shows delighted children and adults alike with crude but hilarious political satire that somehow slipped past the notice of the authorities. Theaters, still a relatively new and controversial form of entertainment, drew packed houses eager to watch dramatic tragedies and biting comedies that often mirrored the very court intrigues happening just across town. Taverns buzzed late into the night with music, card games, and gossip traded over cheap wine, serving as the unofficial news network of the entire city long before anything like a newspaper existed in any modern sense. In many ways, these small pockets of joy were what made the crushing weight of daily survival even bearable at all. Religion, meanwhile, was woven into absolutely every corner of daily existence, impossible to separate from politics, from art, from the very rhythm of the calendar itself. Church bells did not just mark the hour, they marked the entire structure of the day, calling workers to prayer, warning of danger, and celebrating festivals that briefly transformed the grim streets into something closer to a carnival. Processions wound through the city on holy days, priests carrying relics past crowds who pressed forward desperate for a blessing, a cure, or simply a moment of hope in lives that offered very little of it. Yet beneath this public devotion simmered real tension, old wounds from decades of brutal religious warfare that had torn the country apart just a generation earlier, wounds that never fully healed and occasionally reopened in ugly, violent ways. Behind every stone, every square, every garden you have just walked through, there were real people pulling the strings of power, and their choices shaped the very bones of this city. In the early decades of the century, a young king ruled alongside a brilliant and ruthless cardinal, an uneasy but effective partnership that held the entire kingdom together through war and constant political scheming. When that king died, another equally sharp cardinal stepped in to guide his successor, steering France through rebellion and fragile peace with calm, calculated patience, quietly shaping the mind of the boy who would grow up to become the most famous king in French history. That boy grew up haunted by memories of chaos in the streets around him, riots and uprisings that had once forced his own family to flee the city in fear. He never forgot that feeling of vulnerability, and when he finally took full control of the throne, he made a decision that would change Paris forever. He decided that grandeur itself would become his weapon. Old medieval walls were torn down to make way for broad, sweeping boulevards. New squares were carved directly into the crowded heart of the city, celebrating military victories in stone and bronze. Triumphal arches rose to glorify royal power, announcing to every visitor and every citizen exactly who was in charge. He founded new institutions, strengthened the military, and filled the streets of Paris with architects, sculptors, and fountain makers, all working under his singular vision of order, symmetry, and classical elegance. Even after he built his famous palace outside the city and moved his official court there, Paris remained his true stage, transformed piece by piece into a living monument to his own reflection. Around this king, an entire constellation of family members orbited with their own duties and ambitions. His brothers were shaped from childhood for service and strategic alliance. The women of his family, daughters, nieces, and powerful companions within the court wielded quiet but very real influence behind closed doors, often deciding outcomes that history books would later credit entirely to men. Together, this tightly disciplined family became something closer to a machine than a household, every member playing a precise role in maintaining and expanding the power of the crown. By the later decades of the century, even nature itself had been bent to this same obsession with control. The great royal gardens on the western edge of the city were completely reshaped under the king's orders, transformed into sweeping geometric patterns of broad alleys, perfectly clipped hedges, and precisely arranged flower beds. Parisians strolling through these gardens were, whether they realized it or not, walking through a physical symbol of exactly how their king wanted his entire kingdom to feel: calm, measured, and impeccably arranged, no matter how much turmoil actually simmered underneath the surface. And that, in the end, is the real story of 17th century Paris. It was a city living two lives at once. On one side, mud, hunger, disease, and desperation, ordinary people packed together fighting simply to survive another winter. On the other side, breathtaking ambition, kings and cardinals reshaping stone and river and sky itself to project an image of unstoppable glory. Both of these Parises existed on the exact same streets, sometimes in the exact same square, at the exact same moment. That collision, beauty built directly on top of suffering, order imposed over chaos, is what makes this era so unforgettable, and honestly, so hard to look away from even today. So the next time you picture Paris, do not just imagine the postcard version, the clean cafes and glowing tower lights. Imagine the mud beneath the marble, the beggars beneath the palaces, the fear behind every polished smile in every royal garden. That is the Paris that built the version of the city we know today. A city forged not just from stone and ambition, but from the sweat, hunger, and quiet endurance of people whose names history never bothered to write down. If this journey into the past pulled you in, make sure you are subscribed, because there are far stranger, far darker, and far more fascinating corners of history still waiting for us to uncover together.